Greetings. I just got back from the Faithless Forum, which was absolutely incredible. I'd like to tell you more, but I'm still jet-lagged and need time to put my thoughts together before I really catch you up on it. At this point, I'll just say it was a ridiculous honor to be there, and other YouTubers should be uploading footage of the event soon, so keep an eye out for that. For today, however, we're getting back to Voddie's attempts at proving the Bible. Last time we talked about Paul's 500 eyewitnesses, and today we're getting into a topic I find much more interesting: the number of manuscripts attesting to Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. My goal is to give you a couple bite-sized facts that you can use in conversation with believers, so don't worry about this getting all dry and academic. Because honestly, this argument is so stupid we really don't need to.
Oh, I hear you. You're well-educated people. You've heard the arguments. Yes, brother, I understand that, but you see what happened was there were individuals who came and doctored the Bible up, and it's been translated so many times, and it's been changed so many times. And when I talk to college students sometimes, they tell me about this myth of these overzealous monks who went out and changed the Bible so that things would match up, so that it would look like we have older documents than we actually have.
Ooh, I'm immediately skeptical. I've never heard any New Testament scholar propose that a bunch of monks conspired to revise thousands of manuscripts. And even if anybody does believe this, it's far from the best explanation for why the New Testament isn't reliable. But let's see what he ends up saying here. Who knows? Maybe he'll surprise us with something awesome instead of just beating the shit out of an elaborate straw man.
And in fact, and I think they're really telling me something when they tell this, we don't have any of the originals. Like I'm supposed to shake in my boots when they tell me that. Listen to me. If overzealous monks want to change the Bible, can I explain to you what they would have had to do?
Okay, so I retract my expressed hope for anything awesome. It's definitely going to be the straw man one. Geez, can apologists at least try not to be predictable?
3 levels of conspiracy. Level number 1, they would have had to have a manuscript conspiracy. When we're talking about just the New Testament itself, there are over 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts for the New Testament itself.
Pastors love making claims about the number of Bible manuscripts. And there's a good reason they do, which is that most people in the pews have practically no idea of where books like the Bible come from. They're aware that they have printed English Bibles in their hands, and they know that these Bibles were translated from ancient manuscripts, which are handwritten sources in languages like Greek or Latin or Hebrew. But that's about it. Most of them have practically no appreciation for the tremendous variety of things that fall under the word manuscript. And to risk making a broad generalization, they tend to lump together all ancient manuscripts as being roughly equivalent sources from which we get our translations of the Bible. So when a speaker like Voddie says there are 6,000 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, it's easy for an audience to be impressed, even though the sheer number of manuscripts has little to do with the quality of a source and practically nothing to do with whether or not an event happened. A fact we'll talk about soon.
Now that may not sound like a lot to you, but can I compare it to a couple of things? Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars. That's how we know about Julius Caesar and his conquest. We have around 10 manuscripts. Aristotle's Poetics. We have nearly 5 manuscripts. When it comes to the writings of Herodotus, we have less than 10 manuscripts. When it comes to the writings of Homer, less than 10 of each of his writings. When it comes to the New Testament, we have 6,000 manuscripts or portions of manuscripts for the New Testament. Folks, that's not even close.
Now, first off, I call bullshit on a lot of these numbers. His claim that there are only 10 copies of Homer's work is suspect to say the very least, and I suspect he's switching what counts as a manuscript when he talks about the Bible versus other sources. For the sake of time, I'm going to avoid this rabbit trail and stick to the Bible. But one thing I will point out is how smoothly he switches between the word manuscripts and the phrase portions of manuscripts. This is not an accident, and the inclusion of portions of manuscripts is used to pad the New Testament count with practically worthless scraps of paper. To give you an idea, this tiny little thing is counted among the portions of manuscripts Voddie and others refer to. Just look at this thing. Do you think it does anything whatsoever to verify stories in the Bible? I kinda doubt it. And fragments like this make up more of the manuscript count the earlier we go back in the body of New Testament texts. But steering away from that entirely, I'd like to briefly explain what's meant when we talk about a manuscript to begin with. Basically, a manuscript is any document that was written by hand. That's all. Thus, a Greek manuscript of the New Testament, while it sounds super duper important, is literally anything handwritten in Greek during a time that extends to the 16th century. The 16th fucking century! For point of reference, many of the copies were produced after Christopher Columbus sailed to the Americas. Yet they're included in an account of manuscripts just because they happen to have been produced before wide-scale printing and were thus written by hand. Pause for a moment and reflect on the fact that that's what Christians count as textual evidence for Jesus' resurrection. But apologists obscure this by shifting between two facts about the Greek New Testament manuscripts. First, the number of them that exist, and second, the age of the earliest ones. When they state that there are 6,000 Greek manuscripts dating back to 120 years after Christ's death, they give the impression that thousands of reliable and relevant documents have been on the scene since shortly after the time of Christ. But this is very clearly not the case. As Voddie admitted, we have no original documents. But that's not even the half of it. We have literally nothing until the 2nd century, over which time we have a whopping 8 manuscript fragments. Our earliest complete copies of the New Testament are from the 4th century, and the number of manuscripts is extremely sparse up until about 1,000 years after the time of Christ. It's only after that time that a massive number of documents explodes onto the scene. So why are most of the documents concentrated in these centuries? I'm simplifying a bit for the sake of time, but in the earliest years of the Church, copies of Gospels or epistles were made and passed around on a rather haphazard basis by amateur followers who did not think of the material as Scripture. This eventually changed when, after agreeing upon which versions of which books were to be included in the Bible, the Church started creating scriptoriums, filled with professional scribes, that essentially acted like the medieval version of the printing press. These pumped out large volumes of our most consistent versions of the New Testament. And it's this, not a weird conspiracy by monks, that gave us so many manuscripts that agreed so closely with each other. In short, the overwhelming majority of these 6,000 New Testament Greek manuscripts were mass-produced more than 1,000 years after Christ's death. But this leaves us an interesting question with a very telling answer. Why does this chart suddenly decline and then stop after the 16th century? A lot of you are already a step ahead of me when I tell you that this was shortly after Gutenberg invented his movable type printing press. There was no reason to produce manuscripts when you could just print the Bible. So if people count manuscripts from the 1700s as evidence for Christ, then why don't they count printed copies of the Bible from the 1800s? Hell, why don't people count the Bibles that are being printed today? The only reason that the Bibles in the 1800s are no longer considered manuscripts is because the tool of mass-producing documents changed from handwriting to the printing press. So not only do apologists like Voddie use a simplified criteria of manuscript count to determine historical reliability, but most of their count is made up of documents that were mass-produced closer to our time than to the time of Christ. Relying on the fact that the average Christian doesn't know that a Greek manuscript is literally anything written by hand in Greek at any time in human history, they build an entire argument around the misunderstanding of a single term. They are liars and frauds, or they irresponsibly repeat things they heard from liars and frauds, and their claims about the number of New Testament manuscripts is a transparent sham that isn't taken seriously by any honest academic anywhere and simply doesn't belong in the conversation. Tell that to the next Christian who brings up this stupid f***ing argument.